The call came in on a Wednesday afternoon, and I almost didn't answer it because I was elbow deep in a catering order for 32 people, and my phone was balanced on the edge of the prep counter where it had no business being. It was my brother's wife. She was calling to tell me that the paperwork had cleared and that she and my brother wanted to celebrate with me over dinner that weekend. Her voice had that particular warmth people use when they've already spent the money in their heads. I told her I'd check my schedule. I set the phone back down on the counter, and I stood there for a moment with my hands still covered in flour, and I thought about the recording on my laptop and the attorney's email I had forwarded 40 minutes earlier, and I thought, enjoy the dinner reservation while you still can. I should explain what led to that moment, because without the 14 months before it, the Wednesday phone call just sounds like a story about a lucky break. It wasn't a lucky break. It was the result of paying very close attention for a very long time, and of understanding that the people who love you are sometimes exactly the people you need to be most careful around. My mother was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's in the spring of the year I turned 29. She was 61. The neurologist delivered the news in a room with a window that faced a parking structure, and my mother sat very still in the exam chair and asked 3 precise questions about disease progression, medication schedules, and driving restrictions in that order. She had always been organized. She had built her entire adult life around the idea that preparation was a form of love, and she applied that logic to her own illness with a thoroughness that I still find remarkable when I think about it now. I am a licensed property manager. I oversee a portfolio of residential units for a mid-sized real estate firm in Columbus, Ohio, and my work requires a specific kind of patience, the kind that involves reading lease agreements carefully, tracking maintenance timelines, documenting every communication, and maintaining records that can withstand scrutiny from multiple directions simultaneously. I am used to situations where the paperwork tells a different story than the conversation. I am used to the gap between what someone says and what they've actually signed. My brother is 4 years older than me. He works in sales, the kind of sales that involves a lot of driving and a lot of optimism and a moderate amount of actual income. He married his wife Patrice 7 years ago at a venue outside of Cincinnati that cost more than either of them had. And they have 2 kids who are lovely in the specific way that children are lovely when you see them 3 times a year. When my mother was first diagnosed, my brother called me twice in the same week, which was more than he had called me in the previous 4 months combined. He said the right things. He said that family shows up for family. He said that we needed to be present for Mom in whatever way she needed. I remember feeling genuinely moved by that conversation. I remember thinking that maybe the distance between us, which had grown gradually and without fanfare over the years since our father left, was something that a shared crisis might close. That feeling lasted approximately 6 weeks. What replaced it was the arithmetic of caregiving, which is the kind of math nobody teaches you and nobody wants to know. My mother's apartment in Westerville needed modifications. Grab bars in the bathroom, a ramp over the back threshold, a medication management system that locked and dispensed on a timer. Her insurance covered a portion of her neurologist visits, but not her physical therapy copays, not the occupational therapist who came on Tuesdays, not the aide who helped with morning routines 3 days a week. I started keeping a spreadsheet in March of that first year. By December, it had 47 line items. My brother contributed to 3 of them. Once when I asked directly, twice when Patrice apparently felt guilty enough to Venmo me without his knowledge, which I know because she texted me separately asking me not to mention it to him. He came to Columbus 4 times in 14 months. Each visit lasted a weekend. Patrice accompanied him on 2 of those trips. She was pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they are performing pleasantness, and she spent a significant portion of each visit photographing my mother for what she described as keeping the family updated, which was a phrase that implied a family larger and more attentive than the one we actually had. My brother helped move a piece of furniture once. He expressed concern about the cost of my mother's care with some regularity, particularly as it related to what he referred to as the eventual estate, which is a phrase that landed differently each time he used it, depending on how tired I was. My mother owned 2 things of meaningful value. The first was her house, a 3-bedroom Craftsman in Westerville that she and my father had bought in 1991, and that she had paid off a loan after the divorce. The second was a retirement account that she had been building since she was 27 years old, through a combination of discipline and the kind of quiet financial planning that nobody notices until it matters. She had also, over the years, accumulated a small collection of jewelry that had belonged to her mother. Nothing museum-worthy, but weighted with the particular gravity of inherited things. In the February of the second year of her illness, my mother's condition shifted in the way her neurologist had described it might. Not a sudden change, but a compression, as though time itself had decided to accelerate. She was still herself, still sharp in the specific ways that mattered to her, but the physical requirements of her daily life had expanded past what the 3-day aid schedule could support. I began stopping by every morning before work. I rearranged my showing schedule. I took her to appointments. I learned the names of every medication, the timing of each dose, the specific interactions to watch for. I kept a binder. It was the binder, actually, that started to change things between my brother and me. He saw it at Thanksgiving and made a joke about it. Something about how I had always been the organized one, about how it was a good thing I was around since he could barely keep track of his own schedule. He said it with affection, or what passed for affection, and the table laughed. I did not think about it much at the time. I filed it away the way I file away lease violations, noted, not yet relevant, but documented. My mother passed on a Sunday morning in early April. She had asked, some months before, to be at home when it happened, and she was. I had been there through the night. My brother arrived 4 hours after I called him, which I know because I have the call log. The conversation about the estate began 11 days later, not at the funeral. My brother had the grace to wait until the reception was over, and my mother's neighbors had gone home, and the last of the casserole dishes had been returned to their owners. It began in my mother's kitchen, which still smelled like her, which I think he knew, which I think was intentional. He had a folder. This detail is not something I am dramatizing. He had an actual manila folder with printed documents inside it, and he set it on my mother's kitchen table with the careful casualness of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. Inside it were what he described as findings from a financial advisor he and Patrice had recently consulted, someone who had apparently reviewed my mother's estate documents as a favor and discovered some significant complications. There were capital gains considerations related to the house, he said. There were tax implications for the retirement account that would be substantially reduced if the estate went through probate in the standard way. He and Patrice, after careful thought, were prepared to handle the estate administration themselves, which would require me to assign my interest in the estate to him as executor. A process, he said, that his advisor had described as fairly routine. He said all of this while standing in our mother's kitchen. He said it gently. He said it like someone reading a weather report for bad weather that was nobody's fault. I am a property manager. I have read more estate-adjacent documents than most people encounter in a lifetime. I know what an executor's authority looks like and what it does not look like. I know that assigning your interest is not a step in the probate process. It is a transfer of ownership. I know that capital gains on a primary residence have specific exclusions that his framing had carefully not mentioned. I know these things the way I know lease violation timelines, not because I was looking for a problem, but because the work of paying attention is not something you turn off. I did not say any of this in my mother's kitchen. I said that I was still processing things and that I'd need some time before I could think clearly about estate logistics. I said this in a voice that I hoped sounded exactly as hollow as someone 11 days out from losing their mother. It was not a difficult performance. He called 3 times over the following week. Each call introduced a new element of urgency. There was a window for a specific tax filing. There was a deadline with the county assessor's office. There was some issue with the retirement account custodian that required a decision soon. The calls had the rhythm of a pressure campaign, which is what they were, and I recognize the rhythm because I have had tenants try to pressure me into waiving late fees using the same basic tempo, escalating urgency, artificial deadlines, the suggestion that delay itself is a choice with consequences. On the ninth day after his first kitchen conversation, I called my college friend Ingrid. Ingrid is a CPA who now works in estate and trust accounting in Cleveland, and she has the particular gift of being able to explain complex financial structures in plain language without making you feel stupid for not already knowing them. I described the contents of the folder. I described his framing. She asked me to photograph every page and send them to her. She called me back 2 hours later. The capital gains framing was misleading. My mother's primary residence qualified for the stepped-up basis provision, which substantially changed the tax picture he had presented. The retirement account distribution timeline he had described was based on rules that had been updated by federal legislation several years earlier. His advisor's version was outdated in ways that were convenient for him. The language he was using about executor authority described powers that an executor does not actually have in Ohio without court approval and beneficiary consent. Ingrid used the phrase, "This is not ignorance, this is architecture," and I wrote it down. The following Saturday, I drove 45 minutes to a Best Buy and bought a small digital recorder, the kind that fits in a jacket pocket and runs for 12 hours on a single charge. I tested it in the parking lot before I drove home. I tested it again in my kitchen. Then I called my brother and told him that I had been thinking about what he'd said and that I wanted to sit down and go through the details together, that I felt bad about how distracted I'd been, and that I wanted to understand the situation properly before making any decisions. He suggested dinner that same week. People who believe they are close to something they want tend to move quickly. We met at a restaurant in Dublin, the suburb where he and Patrice had stayed when they were in town for the funeral. It was a quiet place, good acoustics, the kind of restaurant with good lighting and booths that offered actual privacy. Patrice did not come, which I hadn't expected, but which worked in my favor. My brother tends to be more direct when she isn't there to moderate him. I let him do most of the talking for the first 20 minutes. He went through the folder again, this time with a printed summary from his advisor that introduced a new figure, a carrying cost deficit associated with the estate that, he explained, would fall to the beneficiaries proportionally if not handled correctly. The number was specific and large and had no citation I could find in any of the supporting documents. I asked him to explain it in more detail. What followed was 15 minutes that I have thought about many times since. He described the estate situation with the confidence of a man who had never been asked to show his work. When I asked gentle follow-up questions, where did this figure come from? What specific filing generated this liability? Which provision of Ohio probate law was he referencing? The answers became less precise and more frustrated. When I said, quietly, that I had spoken with an accountant who had described the stepped-up basis provision differently than he had, he set down his fork. He said that I was making this harder than it needed to be. He said that he had put real time into this and that I was being ungrateful. Then he said that if I chose not to cooperate with the estate plan he and Patrice had developed, he would pursue a formal accounting of every dollar I had spent from the joint account my mother had added me to for caregiving purposes, an account he had never once contributed to, and that he would characterize those expenditures as self-dealing, which is a legal term with specific implications, and he said it with the confidence of someone who had looked it up recently. He named a dollar figure. He said the phrase, "create a real problem for you," in a register I recognized as performative certainty. He said that the estate would get messy and that I was the one who would be left holding the mess. The recorder was in my jacket pocket. It had been running since the parking lot. 2 days later, I was sitting in the office of an estate attorney named Anne-Marie, who worked out of a firm on North High Street that 3 separate people in my professional network had recommended. I brought Ingrid's analysis, my own documentation from the caregiving period, the spreadsheet, the binder, the bank statements from the joint account showing every disbursement with corresponding receipts, and the audio file, which I had already had transcribed. Anne-Marie reviewed everything over the course of about 90 minutes. Then she looked at me across her desk and said that what my brother had described at dinner constituted attempted coercion of a beneficiary in connection with estate proceedings, and that the recording made that characterization very supportable. She also asked whether I had seen my mother's original will and trust documents, the complete versions. I had. My mother had given me a copy 2 years earlier, in the particular organized way she had done everything. Anne-Marie asked me to look at page 11 of the trust agreement. My mother had included a no contest clause with extended provisions. The standard version disinherits anyone who challenges the will without probable cause. My mother's version, drafted by a careful attorney who had apparently known her well, included additional language specifying that any beneficiary found to have employed misrepresentation, coercion, or financial manipulation against another beneficiary in connection with the estate administration would forfeit their interest in the estate entirely, with that interest reverting to the non-offending beneficiary. My mother had been a property manager herself, briefly in her early 30s. She understood documents. She understood that the fine print is where the actual agreement lives. Anne-Marie filed the documentation with the probate court the following Thursday morning. She filed a copy of the audio transcript with my brother's attorney the same afternoon, which was a Friday, which meant he received it over a weekend. He called me on Saturday. Not his attorney. Him, personally, from his cell phone, at 9:14 in the morning. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:31, and at 10,007, and at 11:52, which was a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes and covered a range of emotional registers, from confusion to anger to something that was trying very hard to sound like hurt feelings. I listened to all of them once. Then I forwarded them to Anne-Marie and added them to the file. His attorney contacted Anne-Marie the following Tuesday. The conversation was, by her account, brief and productive. The probate court issued its findings 8 weeks later. The no contest provision was triggered on the grounds of documented financial misrepresentation and coercive conduct. My brother's interest in the estate was forfeited. The house in Westerville, the retirement account, the jewelry, all of it passed me as the sole remaining beneficiary per the trust's own terms. His advisor, the one whose analysis had been so carefully structured around figures that didn't exist, received a referral to the Ohio State Bar's Disciplinary Review Board for his role in the process. I did not pursue that outcome. Anne-Marie flagged the conduct independently as part of her own professional obligation. I want to be honest about what I felt when the ruling came through, because the honest version is more complicated than the satisfying version. I did not feel like I had won something. I felt like I had stopped losing something, which is different. I felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent a long period of time paying extremely close attention and who can now finally stop. I used a portion of the estate to pay off the credit card debt I had accumulated during the caregiving period, the co-pays, the AIDS hours, the grab bars and the ramp and the medication management system. The amounts were exact. I had the receipts. I sold the house in Westerville 8 months later to a young couple who had a toddler and a second one on the way, and who stood in my mother's kitchen and talked about what color they would paint it. I stood in the doorway and watched them, and I thought about my mother and her binder and her 3 precise questions in the neurologist's office, and I thought that she would have liked them, and that she would have been glad the house was going to someone who would fill it with noise. My brother has not contacted me since the ruling. I have not contacted him. I do not expect that to change, and I find that I am at peace with the fact that I no longer have to manage what I feel about him, which was always more work than he was worth. What I keep returning to is something my mother said in the last coherent conversation we had, about 2 weeks before the end. She said that the hardest part of building anything, a house, a retirement account, a life, is that the people who didn't help build it sometimes feel the most entitled to benefit from it. She said this without apparent bitterness. She said it the way she said most things, as a simple observation about how the world worked, filed alongside everything else she had learned and organized and prepared. I wrote it down in the binder. I still have the binder. I want to ask you something, and I mean it as a real question, rather than a way to end the story, on a note that feels tidier than the actual ending. If someone you trusted spent years reframing your contribution as a liability, how long would it take you to understand what was happening? And once you understood it, once you saw the architecture clearly, what would you do with that knowledge? I don't think the answer is obvious. I think it depends on how tired you are, and on whether the habit of paying attention has survived everything that was trying to exhaust it out of you. In my case, it had. There's something nobody tells you about being the one who stays. Not just in the room, not just through the hard appointments and the medication timelines, but the one who stays attentive, who keeps the binder, tracks the receipts, reads the documents twice. People tend to interpret that kind of thoroughness as personality, as though some people are just built for the detail work and others aren't, and that the difference is temperamental rather than chosen. But I don't think that's true. I think attention is a practice. And like most practices, it either holds or it doesn't, depending on what you've decided it's worth. What my brother decided was that my attention was a resource he could redirect. He watched me manage my mother's care for over a year, and somewhere in that time, the story he told himself shifted. My presence became the reason he didn't need to show up. My competence became the justification for his absence. And when my mother passed and the estate became a real thing with real numbers attached to it, he arrived with a folder and a set of figures that had been designed very carefully to make me feel like the burden was mine to absorb. What he did not account for was that I had spent 14 months learning exactly how to read a document. He handed me fabricated numbers in a house that still smelled like my mother, and I recognized the architecture of what they were. Not because I was suspicious by nature, because I had been paying attention long enough that I could feel the difference between a thing that was true and a thing that had been constructed to resemble truth. Ingrid told me later that what struck her, reviewing the materials he'd presented, wasn't the dishonesty exactly. She'd seen financial misrepresentation in estates before. What struck her was the confidence of it, the assumption that I wouldn't look closely, that the grief, the exhaustion, the accumulated weight of everything I had carried would be enough to keep me from asking the one question that mattered. Does this actually add up? It didn't. And my brother had counted on the fact that I wouldn't check. I think about that assumption sometimes. Not with anger, mostly. Anger is expensive, and I've stopped spending money I don't have. I think about it because it contains something useful. The people who attempt this kind of thing, who construct a story designed to separate you from what's yours, are almost always counting on one of two things: that you don't know enough to challenge them, or that you're too depleted to try. The defense against both is the same. You stay curious. You stay rested enough to read carefully. You find one person like Ingrid who will look at the numbers with you without judgment. My mother understood this. She built her entire estate around the premise that the details matter, not because she expected betrayal, but because she was a woman who had learned, through her own difficult years, that the people who love you are not always the same as the people who will protect you. She put language in her trust that I didn't even know was there until Anne-Marie found it. She prepared for a version of events she hoped would never happen. That preparation, made quietly and years in advance, was the thing that ultimately held. What I carry forward from all of it is this: ethics isn't a feeling, it's a practice. It's the choice you make, day after day, to be someone whose word and whose work can withstand examination. My brother's plan collapsed, not because of bad luck, but because it was built on the assumption that I wouldn't look. Every deception has that same structural weakness. Scrutiny is the one thing it cannot survive. I'm still working through what it means to have lost a brother and a mother in the same season. I don't think those two griefs are separable, not entirely. But I know that my mother's careful, quiet insistence on documentation, on precision, on preparing even for the things you hope won't come, that carried me through. And I think that's the thing worth keeping.